So last week, the end of the scripture that we talked about, the disciples, Simon Peter and the others, were leaving behind 2 boats full of fish to follow Jesus. And now this week's scripture, just in the next chapter, we see that the guys are so hungry. They're walking through grain fields, picking off the heads of grain and rubbing them in their hand just to be able to eat a few kernels. Like, this discipleship thing is no joke. St. Francis of Assisi, you may know some of his story. He was born a wealthy son. His dad was a cloth merchant, and Francis was, in one source I looked at, he was accused of squandering his youth in excessive fun. Now, I'm not sure how I feel about the idea of fun being squandering, or even the concept that one can have excessive fun, but you get the idea, right? Francis was well set up, he was comfortable, he was part of a rich family, and then God started talking to him. And one vision in particular, Francis was in a church building that was literally falling apart, and from the crucifix, Christ spoke to him and said, "Rebuild my church." And with what may be a pretty astounding level of literalness, Francis decided it meant he needed to rebuild that physical church building. So he snuck over to his dad's shop while his dad was out of town, stole some cloth, sold it, took the money to the priest at the chapel that was falling down and said, "Here, use this money, fix your chapel." But of course the priest did not want to get in the middle of that, and he really didn't want to get on the bad side of Francis's dad, so he said no. As you might imagine, when Dad came home from his trip and found his valuable cloth gone, he was furious. Eventually, Francis got called before the bishop. Dad was there, all kinds of people gathered around as the bishop was explaining to Francis fairly fervently how he should not have stolen anything, how the church did not want this tainted money. And Francis decided that the bishop was right. He gave his dad back the bag of money that he had from selling the cloth, and Francis took off all the clothes he was wearing and gave those to his dad too, at which point the horrified bishop had to rush down and throw a robe around Francis. That was Francis's way of breaking ties with his earthly father to commit fully to following the way of Jesus. And from then on, Francis did not live a life of luxury. He was begging in the streets. He was repairing broken down church buildings with his own bare hands. He was tending to the sick and nursing them. He started the Franciscan order. He led a very different life once he committed to follow Jesus. And this discipleship thing is no joke. And obviously, we're not all going to renounce vast fortunes, right, to be a disciple of Jesus. But we are all called to give of our material goods, to share. There is a biblical concept of a tithe, where you take at least 10% of your own income to share and to give away to others. A friend of mine, another pastor, was telling me this week that she brought up this concept with her stewardship committee about tithing and how we should give 10%. And one of the people on the committee said, "Well, if we did that, we'd really have to change around how we're living our life." And my pastor friend replied, "Well, yeah, that's kind of the point, right? There is a certain amount of financial sacrifice, material sacrifice that is asked of us in our discipleship, in our following Jesus. But it's not only about the material sacrifices, Right? It's interesting, when you read today's passage, we have the 2 Sabbath stories and then the story about Jesus naming the 12 apostles. And that last story about the apostles seems pretty far removed from the other 2. Like, it's a totally separate thing. But notice that what happens right before Jesus names the apostles is that we are told how angry the religious leaders are with Jesus, right? And it says that they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. It's after that Jesus names these apostles, which means that when they say yes to Jesus' call, they are attaching themselves to someone who is in pretty bad standing with the religious authorities. So they are risking their own social standing. They're attaching themselves to someone who is actually having his life threatened. People have already tried to kill Jesus at least once at this point in Luke. So there's a certain physical threat that they're accepting when they say yes to Jesus' call. Some of you might remember back in 2005 when the Christian Peacemaker team, 4 members of the Christian Peacemaker team, were kidnapped in Iraq. Norman Kember was one of them. He had been a biophysics professor in London, and because he was a pacifist and a Christian, he decided to work with Christian Peacemaker teams. And so he ended up, rather than teaching in a university classroom, he ended up being held captive in Iraq for about 4 months. 3 months into their captivity, his friend and his fellow team member, Tom Fox, was killed by their captors. His body was found in the trash heap. And it was a few weeks after that finally Norman and the other 2 team members were rescued by armed forces that found out where they were and were able to come in and get them. So this obviously too is a rather ironic and a rather awkward situation for pacifists to be rescued by armed forces. But Norman gave up a lot of safety and security and social standing to follow what he perceived to be the call of Christ in his life. This discipleship thing is no joke. And up to this point in the sermon, I want to point out that I'm doing a really good job of being very Mennonite, right? This is what Mennonite sermons are supposed to be. We talk about discipleship, and we talk about sacrifice, and we talk about how we will risk our safety and give away our money for the good of God's work in the world. And that is all absolutely true. And it is all absolutely in the scripture that we're reading today. And I also want us to pay attention to what else is in the scripture today. Yes, following Jesus requires sacrifice, but it also provides us with God's provision, right? And we get to embrace freedom and wholeness and even a little bit of humor. Those are all there too. I mean, the disciples at the beginning, they might not be having a fish fry, but they are getting fed. They do have food to eat. And the freedom, right, what Jesus is offering to these first century disciples is a freedom from the restrictive Sabbath rules that have been placed on them, and by extension, possibly other oppressive religious rules. Jesus is saying that mercy and compassion are the key rules here if you want to be faithful to God. And all of these other pieces of that could be so complicated and really hard for certain people in certain situations, those aren't as important. And there's such a freedom in that for his followers in the first century. I think for us in the 21st century, We might want to think a little more about the freedom that's offered in the fact that Jesus does, in fact, practice Sabbath. Jesus is not throwing Sabbath out the window. He still practices Sabbath. And for us today, I think we're more likely to have no Sabbath rules at all than we are to try to follow super strict, unreasonable Sabbath rules. But having a Sabbath, having a time set aside every week to not work, to focus on your own spiritual care and nurture, your connection with other people, your connection with God, your connection with nature, having that space in your week, every week, it is a freedom that is offered to us as followers of Jesus, just as it is offered to the Jewish people as followers of the Torah. We can also claim this freedom in Sabbath and experience freedom from work and obligation and freedom from that relentless pressure to be productive. And there aren't many places to experience that kind of freedom in our modern culture. So discipleship offers provision, and it offers freedom, and it offers wholeness. We see this man with the withered hand, and the hand is restored. He stretches it out, and it's healed. Immediately after today's reading, Jesus gives his Sermon on the Plain, which is Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount. It's the longest collection in Luke of the teachings and the sayings of Jesus. As part of giving that sermon, Jesus heals all the people who have gathered. A lot of the folks who've come to hear him have also come to be healed, and Jesus offers that healing to them. There's healing and there's wholeness that is offered to those of us who follow Jesus. And I think there's a little bit of humor here. I really like the reading by Amy Robertson. She's a Jewish scholar. And she talks about this scene of Jesus and the Pharisees and scribes in the synagogue when he heals the man with the withered hand. She points out that Jesus isn't actually breaking the rules. All he does is talk to the man, and there are no Sabbath regulations that say you can't talk to people. And she says she can just imagine Jesus like locking eyes with the Pharisees, just staring right at them when he tells this guy, go ahead and stretch out your hand. Right? Jesus knows he's healing that guy, and the Pharisees know that Jesus is healing that guy, but he's kind of daring them to do anything about it because he's not really healing the guy. He's only speaking words. I think that that's a funny scene, just like I kind of got cracked up about all the fish in the boats last week, like so much that they're sinking down. There's some funny stuff going on here in Luke's gospel. So I think we do, as followers of Jesus, want to recognize that there is a price to pay for being disciples, that we have to be willing to leave behind some material gain and comfort. And we have to be willing to risk some loss of social standing or even some personal safety. And we also want to remember that there are so many blessings that come with this journey, with this commitment that we've made, that we are blessed with God's provision, and we are blessed with a deep, deep freedom, and we are blessed to participate in and to receive God's healing and wholeness. This discipleship thing is no joke, but I think it probably can involve a few jokes from time to time, right? And maybe even we will be a little bit, have a little bit of excessive fun along the way. There is no group of people I would rather be on this journey with than you all, and I thank you so very much for being on the journey with me.